leaders in the world. In his lifetime, his country has been transformed from a virtual economic colony of the United States to a captive of communist regimes. Following the collapse of its longtime patron, the Soviet Union, his socialist state is struggling to survive. At one time, the charismatic Cuban leader inspired revolutionary movements around the globe. Often with little more than rhetoric, he has frustrated and infuriated his enemies abroad. At home, he has condemned those who opposed him to lengthy jail terms or death. Revolutionary, dictator, communist. Fidel Castro has yet to succeed in bringing to Cuba the workers' paradise he promised as a young man of 32. Yet he continues to reign as one of the most enduring political figures of the 20th century. Fidel Castro Ruz was born in the Oriente province of Cuba in August 1926. Only 90 miles from Florida, this quiet island nation was quickly becoming a playground to America's wealthy. At the time, Prohibition had banned alcoholic beverages in the United States, and whiskey, women, and gambling were among the key attractions in this tropical port of call. Castro's father, however, was hardly part of this early jet set. Angel Castro was an immigrant laborer from Spain who eventually became a successful sugar planter in a region dominated by the American-owned United Fruit Company. He was the father of 8 children. Castro's mother, Elena, had worked as a house servant for Castro's father. She bore him 5 children, including Fidel, before they married. A Spanish possession for more than 350 years, Cuba received its independence after the United States defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War of 1898. But Cuba had learned little about democracy, as elected governments and the army regularly changed hands. In 1933, in a coup known as the Sergeant's Revolt, Fulgencio Batista led a rebellion against dictator Gerardo Machado. Having suffered under a series of incompetent and corrupt rulers for over 30 years, the Cuban population erupted in celebration. Within months, Batista assumed civilian as well as military power. In 1940, he was elected president of Cuba for the first time. While Batista tried to reform the entrenched bureaucracy in Havana, Fidel Castro began his schooling in the city of Santiago de Cuba, where he was considered a bright yet unruly student at a Catholic parochial school. He continued his education in the cosmopolitan capital of Havana at the Jesuit-run Belen College. He went on to study law at the University of Havana, where he saw firsthand the disparity between life for the poor and that of the privileged in this thriving modernized city. Castro became involved in protests against government corruption, which had become widespread since President Batista stepped down in 1944. It was as a student that Castro met and married Mirta Diaz-Balart, the daughter of one of Fulgencio Batista's attorneys. The young couple honeymooned in the United States. In 1948, Castro received his law degree and for a short time defended the poor without asking for compensation. He intended to run for Congress in '52, but the elections were canceled when Batista returned to power for a second time following a military revolt. Unlike his earlier reign as Cuba's leader, Batista's second administration was characterized by unrestrained graft and corruption. Cuba, with its carnivals, clubs, and casinos, became an even more popular American tourist destination. Much of Cuba's industry and vast sugar plantations were controlled by American corporations, and U.S. officials were concerned with maintaining political stability in Cuba as a way of protecting these profitable commercial interests. At glittering social functions, Batista played host to American power brokers. Among his guests was the future president, Senator Richard Nixon. In 1953, Castro, then 26 years old, sold everything he owned. With his brother Raul, he bought $16,000 worth of arms and uniforms. The brothers had decided that changes in Cuba's institutional corruption could only be brought about through an overthrow of the government and military. On July 26th, Castro and 100 followers attacked the 1,000-man-strong Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. Castro's small force was quickly defeated. Though more than 50 of his men were either killed or injured, their fierce determination had captured the imagination of the Cuban people. At his trial, Castro refused to plead guilty. In his defense, he paraphrased a line from Adolf Hitler: "History," Castro wrote, "will absolve me." He received a sentence of 15 years in prison. His brother Raul was sentenced to 13 years. 2 years later, confident in his control over Cuba and unthreatened by the failed insurrectionists who had tried to overthrow him, Batista pardoned the Castro brothers. Upon their release, they were greeted by their supporters. Almost immediately, they began planning their next assault on Batista's government. The failure of Castro's attempted takeover had not deterred other opponents of Batista. Near the University of Havana, student demonstrations frequently verged on anti-government riots. Jose Antonio Echeverria, one of the leaders of the student rebellion, was killed during an assault on Batista's palace in 1957. In less than 4 years, it would become clear that Batista's confidence in pardoning Castro had been unfounded. The young rebel he once held in prison would return to overthrow his former jailer. Only weeks after his release from prison, Fidel Castro left Cuba for Mexico, where he prepared for his war against Batista's regime. He called his followers the July 26th movement, commemorating the date of his failed assault on the Moncada barracks. Soon the movement was joined by a young Argentinian doctor, Ernesto Che Guevara, whose name became synonymous with revolutionary movements in the 1960s. From Mexico, Castro traveled to the United States to ask Cuban exiles to support his campaign against Batista. In return for money, he promised them that he would land an armed force in Cuba by 1957. It was a promise that he would keep.